Hey guys, if you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's simply the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor by Spotify has everything you need all in one place. So let me explain. Now, Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your own cell phone or your own computer. Now, I've been using and loving Anchor by Spotify for 2 years now. And don't forget that Anchor will go ahead and distribute your podcast on so many listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and so many, many more. Now, I think it's simply everything you need to make your own podcast, all in one place. And don't forget, Anchor is totally free. So why don't you go ahead and download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I can't wait to hear all of your podcasts. Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. Now I hope you're all having a great day so far. I know I am. And if it's your first time finding me, thanks so much and welcome. Come on in, you guys. This is episode number 17 of my 7th season. Today is Wednesday, December 28th, 2022. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, this is the very last episode of season 7. We have just a few days left before we fall into another new year, 2023. Wait a minute, is fall into the right words here? How about roll into a new year? Or better yet, how about rise up into 2023? Sounds a whole lot better. Now, I know 2022 was definitely another tough year on me personally, and I'm sure it affected so many of you in a negative way as well. It definitely had a lot of bright spots, but it really is time to say hello to a much better year ahead. Now, I hope you all had a great and joyous Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa, and enjoyed time with family and friends, and celebrated by giving. And of course, I hope Santa and his reindeer gang arrived at your doors as well. I always love seeing pictures of my faraway friends with their still very young children setting up carrots and cookies on their cookie plates on Christmas Eve. So happy that those reindeer are treated so well. Now, all right, you guys, I wanted my last compliance tips and recommendations for 2022 to emphasize the risks to patient management in the new 2021 and revised 2023 E&M guidelines. Now, in particular, I want to give a big shout out to NAMUS, right? The National Alliance of Medical Auditing Specialists, that big conference I just went to a couple weeks ago in Savannah, Georgia. Now, in their educational talks that they presented for both days, they developed a rather wonderful and unique chart for those of us who went to the conference. And I'm going to be talking about that in my Trusty Tip today. And hey, it's my month-end episode where I discuss highlights from the month of December's criminal and civil enforcement cases involving fraud, waste, and abuse. And I go ahead and round out today's episode with a remarkable quote on purpose and impact by the one and only Oprah Winfrey. If you checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve coding accuracy as you help all your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to my podcast. I'd really love your support. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and my recommendations based on my over 12 years of experience in front office, in back end, in coding, and in billing for multi-specialty physicians, in compliance, and in auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. So, Let's get into Newsworthy. The month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of December saw a whopping 42 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early December saw two women arrested on criminal charges related to their alleged participation in schemes to pay illegal kickbacks and bribes to Medicare beneficiaries and Medicaid recipients for medically unnecessary prescriptions filled by various pharmacies that resulted in more than $10.5 million in total losses to both Medicare and Medicaid. One woman was an employee of one of the pharmacies. She allegedly referred an individual to a podiatrist who signed prescriptions, including for durable medical equipment, that her pharmacy and other entities with common ownership then billed to Medicare and Medicaid. She provided the individual with supermarket gift certificates for each prescription brought to the pharmacy and also provided the individual with cash in exchange for the individual's monthly insurance allowance for over-the-counter products. Federal law enforcement agents executed a search of that pharmacy concurrent with her arrest. The second woman was an owner and employee of another pharmacy allegedly involved. She allegedly referred an individual to specific podiatrists who signed prescriptions that the pharmacy then billed to Medicare and Medicaid. She provided the individual with store credit for each prescription brought to her pharmacy. She also provided the individual with supermarket gift certificates in exchange for the individual's monthly insurance allowance for over-the-counter products. Again, federal law enforcement agents executed a search of this pharmacy concurrent with her arrest as well. Two additional pharmacies were searched in the state and out of state as well. Mid-December saw a psychologist admitting to defrauding Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurers. Here, this licensed psychologist had operated a practice out of his home office, along with another licensed psychologist, Individual 1. Both were authorized providers for the state's Medicaid program, Medicare, and other health care benefit programs. The named licensed psychologist assumed responsibility for submitting claims for reimbursement for services allegedly provided by himself and by the other individual, number 1, both at their home office and at various skilled nursing facilities within the state. In pleading guilty, he admitted that he billed insurers for services that he knew were not rendered, including by billing for patients who were deceased, for dates of service when he was out of the country, for dates of service when individual number 1 was out of the country, and for dates of service when he was hospitalized. These fraudulent claims resulted in a loss of over $2 million, including a loss of over $1 million to the state Medicaid program and a loss of over $100,000 to Medicare. Mid-December also saw a medical doctor charged with illegally distributing oxycodone pills. Specifically, the investigation has disclosed that she operated a medical office in which she charged her patients hundreds of dollars in cash in exchange for an illegal monthly oxycodone prescription. These oxycodone prescriptions had no legitimate medical purpose. The cash charge was often in addition to her billing the patient's insurance for a variety of charges, many relating to procedures that never occurred. It is estimated that she made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in cash solely from the cash payments made by patients to obtain their oxycodone prescriptions. For example, it is alleged that she prescribed oxycodone to an undercover agent at every visit, including the first visit. These visits took place over a year-long period, and none of the oxycodone prescriptions had a legitimate medical purpose. In addition, after a search warrant was executed at her medical offices, she reached out to patients and attempted to convince them to alter their testimony about their oxycodone prescriptions. Oxycodone is a scheduled, controlled substance that may be dispensed by medical professionals only for a legitimate medical purpose in the usual course of a doctor's professional practice. It is a powerful and highly addictive drug and is frequently abused because of its potency when crushed into a powder and ingested, leading to a heroin-like euphoria. Late December saw a cochlear implant system device company agreeing to pay more than $12 million to resolve allegations that it misled federal healthcare programs regarding the radio frequency emissions generated by some of its cochlear implant processors. The tests at issue measured the extent to which cochlear implant systems generate radio frequency emissions that can potentially interfere with other devices that use the radio frequency spectrum. Such other devices may include telephones, alarm and security systems, televisions, and radios. The settlement resolves allegations that the device company, in submitting pre-market approval applications to the Food and Drug Administration, that's our FDA, for their two cochlear implant processors, made false claims regarding the results of its radio frequency emissions tests. The company allegedly represented that its processors satisfied an internationally recognized emissions standard, when in fact the company did not comply with that standard. More specifically, the company allegedly failed to honor the standard's requirements to test these processors using worst case configurations and improperly shielded certain emissions generating system components during emissions testing. The company then allegedly sought reimbursement from Medicare, Medicaid, and other federally funded healthcare programs for these devices. The company also entered into a 5-year corporate integrity agreement, or a CIA, with the HHS-OIG. The CIA requires an independent review of activities and processes relating to the preparation or submission of pre-market approval applications, or PMAs, to the FDA and performance standards relevant to those PMAs. The company must also implement a robust compliance program that includes, among other things, a risk assessment program and compliance certifications from key managers and from the board of directors. The settlement provides that the company will pay roughly $11.36 million to the United States, and in addition will pay approximately $1.24 million to the participating Medicaid states involved, pursuant to the terms of separate settlement agreements that the company has or will enter into with those particular states. The settlement resolves a lawsuit originally brought by a former engineer at the company under the key TAM, or whistleblower provisions of the False Claims Act. Under those provisions, a private party can file an action on behalf of the United States and receive a portion of any recovery. As part of this resolution, the whistleblower here will receive approximately $1.87 million of the federal settlement amount. Late December also saw a settlement resolving an investigation by the Office of the Attorney General, the OAG, into illegal Medicaid billing practices for vein treatments performed by a doctor. The OAG found that this doctor submitted more than 1,000 claims for procedures to Medicaid without sufficient documentation to show what procedures were actually performed or why the procedures were medically necessary, resulting in an overpayment of Medicaid reimbursement. As a result of the settlement, this doctor will pay over $2 million to Medicaid, and he will also withdraw from the state's Medicaid program. Details outline that the OAG found that between the years March of 2015 and October of 2021, the doctor submitted claims to Medicaid for procedures without adequate documentation. The OAG investigation into these claims found that medical records did not show which procedures were actually performed, nor did they indicate why the procedures were medically necessary and thus eligible for Medicaid reimbursement. Of course, there were also many of the other usual suspects like more opioids distributors, overprescribing, kickbacks, bribery schemes, and money laundering. But I wanted to pay particular attention to a case involving cardiac monitoring companies to pay more than $44.8 million to resolve False Claims Act liability relating to services performed by offshore technicians. Here, these companies resolve allegations that they violated the False Claims Act by knowingly submitting claims to Medicare, TRICARE, the Veterans Health Administration, and the Federal Employee Health Benefits Program for heart monitoring tests that were performed in part outside the United States and in many cases by technicians who were not qualified to perform such tests. Specifically, the United States alleged that these companies improperly billed Medicare and other federal healthcare programs for certain cardiac monitoring services, including Holter, event monitoring, and mobile cardiovascular telemetry, or MCT tests, that were performed overseas in violation of federal law that prohibits payment for services furnished outside of the United States. More specifically, the government alleged that in 2013, they contracted with a company located in India for the provision of diagnostic and analysis services of heart monitoring data. Although the company set up a workflow that was designed to route electrocardiogram data, including data relating to cardiac events or ECG data, for federal healthcare patients to a domestic independent diagnostic testing facility for review and analysis, the government alleged that the companies, with the knowledge of the then senior management team, directed certain federal patients' ECG data to India when the domestic workflow became backlogged. They also allegedly sent this ECG data for other federal patients directly to India for review. In 2014, over 29% of the ECG data reviewed in connection with those MCT tests and over 78% were allegedly reviewed by technicians located in India. In 2015, those numbers allegedly rose to 47% and over 88%, respectively. Although the companies began implementing technological controls in late 2015 to prevent personnel in India from accessing the domestic workflow, those controls were found to be insufficient, and technicians in India allegedly continued to review and analyze some ECG data for federal healthcare program patients thereafter. The United States further alleged that most of the offshore technicians tasked with reviewing ECG data for federal healthcare program patients did not have the basic qualifications to perform the tests in question. Of the more than 450 India-based technicians who reviewed Medicare patients' ECG data in connection with MCT test services that the companies billed to Medicare during the years 2013 through 2018 timeframe, the government alleged that fewer than 3% were certified by the Cardiovascular Credentialing International, or CCC organization, the only recognized credentialing body for such cardiovascular technicians. Now, in connection with this particular settlement, the companies entered also into a 5-year corporate integrity agreement, or CIA, with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, the HHS OIG, that requires, among other things, the implementation of a risk assessment and internal review process designed to identify and address evolving compliance risks. The CIA also requires an independent review organization to annually assess the medical necessity and appropriateness of claims billed to Medicare. All right. Wow. Right. So those are my highlights from this last month of 2022's enforcement cases. I really think those FDA pre-market applications are a doozy, and they most certainly require the opinion of sound healthcare legal attorneys. Lots of research on your part and your own due diligence. And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So, in today's compliance tip, my very last one for 2022, I wanted to focus on the new spotlight. Well, new since 2021, right? On that last column for our E&M medical decision making levels, right? Our new overhaul for our E&M guidelines that changed for the office and outpatient setting in 2021, and of course those new revisions in 2023 that take effect on January 1st, 2023. So remember, the new focus from the AMA in our 2021 E&M guideline overhaul for the office and outpatient setting was for that last column that I want to just hone in on here today, for that last column for risk of complication and or mortality or morbidity of patient management. So that's the risk to the patient's treatment, the patient's management in this column. So that same thing is reinforced in 2023 for the inpatient setting as well. But what does that translate to, right? What does all of that mean in that last column? So I thought I'd try my best in today's trusty tip to give you some patient examples for each of those levels for our E&M chart. Now, why don't we start at the beginning, right? Let's start with that patient that walks in that's not very sick, right? So that risk level is going to be negligible, or the next level will be below average, and then average, and then above average for the further illness or functional impairment or organ damage will occur based on the documented management options or the documented treatment plans that are considered or already established. So again, I hinted at that first level, that first patient that comes in, that's going to be equated to someone who's not that sick, right? Their management would then require a simple follow-up, or perhaps an additional visit may be required in a couple of weeks, again, if needed. So the risk here to that patient is negligible. Let's move on to the next patient that walks in, right? Where that risk to that patient would be considered below average. So this might equate to that patient who needs some over-the-counter med management, right? Some OTCs, or perhaps some mild physical therapy at the most. The risk to this particular patient with this particular type of treatment would be considered below average. Then let's move on to the next patient, the next risk to the patient for a type of complication or treatment that's considered to be average. I think that's going to be equated to someone who has an illness that requires prescription drug management. What does that mean with our new guidelines? That means that the drug needs to be started. It has to be documented that the drug is being started or continued or stopped, or it needs to be documented that there's a tweak in the dosage of that prescription. Or even better, now in 2023, right, we have codes for the social determinants of health that are at play. There are ICD-10 codes, but we should be documenting what the social determinants are in documentation as well. So if that's being documented, it's definitely impacting the patient's treatment. So their level of risk here with this type of complication impacting treatment, right, is going to be considered average. So in the prescription drug management patient, as well as the SDOH patient, this patient can be considered at average risk. And then finally, for that patient with a risk type of complication or the treatment is considered to be above average, that's going to better equate to someone who really needs to be hospitalized immediately if they're in the office setting and the doctor realizes they need to be rushed off to the hospital. So for that patient, they can be considered above average risk. Or what happens if they're already in the inpatient setting, right? Like our new guidelines suggest for 2023. So if they're already in the inpatient setting, what happens if they're documenting that the patient has now elected their DNR, their do not resuscitate status. Well, that would also qualify for their risk of complication or treatment as above average. Or what happens if there is a patient who requires intensive drug monitoring, if it's long monitoring or short-term monitoring. In either case, these things are done to prevent toxicity in the patient for those types of drugs. So in all three of these instances, this example would be considered above average. So it's all about better documentation. It's always been about better documentation, but most especially with these new 2021 and 2023 E&M guideline overhauls for both the outpatient and inpatient settings. So a better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, I focus Season 7 Spark on purpose and impact. I want this 7th season Spark to be filled with our world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for purpose and impact in all we strive to do. So, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from Oprah Winfrey. There is no greater gift you can give or receive than to honor your calling. It's why you were born and how you become most truly alive. Absolutely true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us to recognize our many gifts, our many passions. I think this quote reminds us that our calling is our purpose. I think this quote reminds us to listen to that calling, to not let it lay dormant. I think this quote inspires us to unleash our passions, our purpose. It is with our passion and our purpose that we can leave our own legacy of impact behind. I'm happy Oprah Winfrey's spark still shines on in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. All right, so in my final note today, I know I'm going to be popping open some Prosecco and enjoy bringing in 2023. I hope you all take the time to watch that ball drop in New York City or watch some fireworks wherever you are in the world. I know Hong Kong puts on a great show. Go ahead and eat and dance and be merry. Dance the whole night away. And remember, in 2023, every day has ample time to carve out a little piece just for you. I wish you all an amazing week ahead, and I'll be seeing you in the new year. Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode, and I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.